We live in a time of global transformation. The Energy Futures podcast explores how we can accelerate the expansion of clean energy technologies and reduce our reliance on fossil fuels. From heating and cooling our homes to moving around our planet and beyond, we bring together researchers, scientists, business leaders, and communicators to exchange knowledge and try to answer one important question. How can we create a sustainable energy future for all? This podcast is produced by Energy Futures Lab of Imperial College London.
On today's Energy Futures podcast, we speak with Dr. Aidan Rhodes, Energy Policy Briefing Papers Fellow, Energy Futures Lab, and Dr. Nadine Moustafa, a Research Associate in Chemical Engineering and Environmental Policy. We'll explore the UK's clean energy goals, the Great British Energy Bill, and the road to zero carbon by 2050.
We've had an interesting week this week a few weeks now. We've got a new government. Energy is being talked about quite a lot at the moment, and we're recording this at the end of July 2024, and we're still getting news in from the government in terms of energy. So I'd like to kind of put this towards you guys first. Nadine, I might come over to you first, actually, because you're on my left. And I'd like to kind of know a bit more about your thoughts and feelings about what is happening currently in the UK in terms of energy, and ultimately our big, audacious goal to zero carbon by 2050.
To be honest, I do think that UK is a global leader in a lot of these things when it comes to like net zero targets. So one of the first countries, I think it was the first country actually, that did the net zero legislation, and then decreased 50% of emissions compared to 1990 over the past decade. So in terms of energy, I think, we're going in the right directions for sure. Coal, I think the last plant is going to close down this year. That's done. So definitely going in the right direction. There's there's works for nuclear power. There's a lot of wind happening. The energy mix is quite, a mix. There's quite a lot in there. But definitely the carbon intensity, for instance, of the electricity grid is going down as we speak. So it's going in the right direction, I would say, for sure.
What a great way to start, feeling really positive already. That's the direction we want to go in. Well, we'll eventually move into doom and gloom a little bit here, because we do have some big challenges, don't we, in the country? So, Aidan, do you want to just touch upon what are the current challenges that we've got now with this new government to get things in the right direction?
So yes, we do absolutely have a new government, which is a lot more positive, I think, on the energy transition than our previous government, which was towards the end, especially of their term, wobbling a bit. However, there is massive challenges still ahead. While, as Nadine's pointed out, we are absolutely a world leader in actually decarbonising our grid, there's still big challenges in actually finishing that decarbonisation, in balancing the grid, in installing an awful lot more wind power, solar power, and also connecting that up to the grid via large-scale pylons, and expanding the national grid to areas where it wasn't usually there in the first place, so offshore and in sort of more rural and dispersed areas of the UK. So there is substantial challenges ahead there, as well as the challenges in electrifying more of our energy use in order to use renewable energy. So electrifying our heating, electrifying our transport, electrifying our industry. All of these are big challenges and will require an awful lot of work going ahead. So while we've done an awful lot of progress in the last 15 years, I think there's still an awful lot to go, and maybe the hardest stuff is still ahead.
Yep, still a long way to go. Okay, so we've mentioned briefly then about energy mix. I'm mindful that we've probably got some audience and listeners that probably don't know everything about the energy mix. They'll be used to oil and gas and coal, and obviously they'll now be familiar with renewables. Nadine, do you want to just jump on the current mix then? What have we currently got in the UK? Where does the majority of our energy come from?
So there's a lot of gas, there's a little bit of coal, but as I said, this is finishing up this year. There's nuclear, there's a lot of wind, there's some solar, and then there's some hydro power. So I think the UK is, again, a global leader when it comes to wind power, for instance. And in terms of like, it was really easy to, well, as Aidan said, like the past 15 years was an easy part because you could just like switch from coal, for instance, to natural gas, which already gives you massive emission reductions. So that was the easy part. Now the harder part is, as Aidan said, electrifying all of this. So like, what are we going to do with all of this natural gas? How are we going to increase our nuclear capacity just to have a base load of electricity? How are we going to do the grid infrastructure for renewable energy as we want to do more and more renewable energy to kind of, accommodate the demand? Mind you, the demand increases, right? So it's not just that we have to accommodate the demand we have now. The demand will increase in the next decade and so on and so forth. So we really need to start thinking about the next 15 years and seeing how that works. But the current energy mix has a lot of different things. As with anything, like I always say this, I think there is no silver bullet technology. We're going to need a bit of everything. Some of the things have challenges, some of the things have advantages, and they kind of accommodate each other so that we can get the energy we need in terms of like energy security, but also to look into the demand and accommodate that in the UK.
Brilliant. Yeah, we mentioned the word mix, don't we, in hybrid and fusion fusion as in mixing different things. And so we've got a green energy manifesto that's been released, and there's a quite ambitious plan by the new government to try and get us to clean energy and zero carbon by 2050. Do you think we're on track to do that? What's your initial feelings? I know that's a loaded question.
So it is a bit of a loaded question, but I'll do my best to answer. I think at the moment, I would say we're probably not on track. If you look at what the Committee on Climate Change has been saying, they are forecasting for the first time the UK might not meet its carbon budget for the next carbon budget accounting round. So we are maybe falling behind where we should be at the moment. And part of this is due to, I think, a slowing down of rollouts. So I would say that a slowdown, not necessarily in actual terms, but in where we need to be compared to where we are. So while we are accelerating in, putting in large-scale offshore wind and putting in large solar farms, we are not accelerating fast enough. And I think the scale of this is actually really quite substantial. We are needing to put in a large amount of generation and also connect that generation. So an awful lot of why we've been slowing down so much is not because the investment necessarily isn't there for the generation, or the will isn't there, or the planning permission isn't there, though sometimes that is the case, but the grid connections aren't there. So we are having, at the moment, big queues to join the national grid to connect up these disparate solar farms, these disparate wind farms. And sometimes these grid connections can go, these grid connection dates can go in the next decade. So I've talked to solar farm developers who have got planning permission for a solar farm, who have got the financing in order to deliver that solar farm, but have been given a collection date to connect to the grid as in the early 2030s. So they're just sitting around on their hands for the next 10 years, basically. And yeah, if we want to get where we need to go, we need to really, I say, accelerate and streamline these delivery processes, so all these various components are going the same way, basically.
Yeah, we probably we can almost break this down into sort of three areas, almost, isn't it? It's like energy production, energy transmission and delivery. But then actually, what we could talk about is a little bit about consumption as well, because although we need policy, we need finance, we need these infrastructures to make this work, but it is a little bit down to individuals as well to understand how much energy we're using, etc. I'm very mindful that we've only got about 35-40 minutes today, so we probably won't be able to go into too much detail. But looking at the current, Nadine, I'll put this onto you, the current energy mix and what we've currently got, and where would you like to see more investment, more time? What's missing here?
I don't know if this is an easy answer, just because it really depends. As Aidan mentioned, so it's easy for me as a scientist or engineer or whatever to go this makes sense, this technology makes sense, let's go do it. But more often than not, it's not as simple as that. There's quite a lot happening at the same time. So it could be something like the grid infrastructure, it could be something like the planning permissions, it could be public acceptance. There's quite a lot to kind of look into before you can say, this is what we should be doing. And so for that reason, I don't think that we should be doing like one thing, but there's quite a few that we should be doing at the same time. One of them is the grid infrastructure for renewable energy. One of them is nuclear power to have our baseload electricity and like rely less on imports, for example, from France. One of them is to, in the interim, if we need CCS for natural gas, then that we might need that. So we should be doing that. And so there's not one single answer. There's quite a lot of things we need to be doing. And in terms of also renewable energy storage, for example, technologies. So yeah, it's a mix, and it will always be a mix. So we would need to kind of figure out what's the mix that makes most sense in terms of economic feasibility, in terms of technical feasibility, in terms of public acceptance, in terms of resource availability, so like land availability, water availability, material availability, and also when you look at materials, thinking about the sustainable supply chains that you can get those materials from. So yeah, it's not one answer. It's a bit of everything, and like looking at what would be the best to kind of reach our net zero targets.
And that's interesting because the mix, like you said, is going to keep changing. It will change with policy. It will change with the weather. It will change with things that are happening globally in terms of markets, etc. It will change with technology, etc. So yeah, that's great for this podcast because we're going to keep revisiting these. We're going to talk about different areas of the mix and all the nuances and all the things that come with those different areas in terms of that mix. You mentioned nuclear. We've all been working together because we've been putting together an amazing briefing paper, white paper that just was launched a few weeks ago. Shall we talk about nuclear? Because it's something that you're very knowledgeable about. Where are we currently with nuclear, and where does it need to go? What's the plan going forward?
I feel like this has been mentioned quite a bit this time, but again, UK was a global leader in nuclear power, but then a lot was decommissioned over the past decade, and some are still being decommissioned now, and so that massively fell compared to other countries in the world. There are excessive plans in nuclear power. I mean, UK is really good at this though. Like they have plans in pretty much everything. So, sustainable aviation and energy storage and energy mix and nuclear power and so on. So they're really good at this. They have plans, they have funds, they're releasing consultations and so on. But the plan is essentially that we want to increase nuclear capacity in the UK, basically, I think, to 25%. And so that's the plan. Whether we're on track is right now not clear. We're not actually on track right now. There's quite a bit of financing that we're going to need to do. I think there's also a lot that we can get from the current nuclear plants that are happening. So for example, with EDF. And so we can transfer this knowledge to make things go faster next time, and we could do them cheaper. And so this is quite important. So like, yes, we're not on track, but how can we be on track? And what can we do in terms of learning from past projects? And then the other thing that I think we mentioned quite a bit in our paper is the fact that, so let's forget the technical feasibility is there. Like most of the technologies that I think will go on this podcast are technically feasible. That's not the issue. Science and engineering has been doing really well. But then the issue then comes from economic feasibility. So yes, technically it works, but it could be very, very expensive. And so that's why, we're still doing science and engineering so that we can make it cheaper, either by increasing its efficiency, using different materials, or so on and so forth. So economic feasibility, so how expensive it is. When it comes to nuclear power, it's also you need to kind of integrate and see what's happening with the public and whether they kind of want the nuclear power plants there. And then last but not least, but the skills and the jobs that you will need. So as I said, so nuclear power, although UK was a global leader for nuclear power 10 years ago, quite a lot of this has been decommissioned. And so there's been a shortage in nuclear power skills. And so we need to kind of focus on how are we going to make sure that we, before the current workforce retires, how are we going to transfer this knowledge? to the upcoming workforce. And so there's quite a lot of aspects. I think this is one of the things that we should be focusing on for sure.
And we will touch on jobs soon because Aidan's very knowledgeable about jobs and green jobs, which we'll jump on in a bit. We're at this sort of steady 15% of nuclear. That, when I look at the sort of energy mix and what's happening at that moment of time, obviously solar and wind up and down all the time, being in the UK and our lovely weather that we have. But energy's at that steady sort of 15, and we're trying to get it to 25 by 2050 or before that? 2050. So how do we get from 15 to 25% then? What do we need to do to be able to do that?
So we need to build more plants, obviously. And that, again, so there's been a couple of there are a couple of plans that are planned, but our paper shows that, that still falls short. We've also done, for example, another paper on sustainable aviation fuels. Again, based on the target that the UK has, it falls short. And so we need to kind of start thinking about where are we going to be doing these plants, how much are they going to cost, how are we going to finance them, and whether those will meet the targets that we've set. But that hasn't been done yet. So there were projects that were going to happen. So there were more projects that were going to happen, but they got cancelled. But even with those, so even assuming the planned ones go ahead and the cancelled ones went ahead, we're still very short. So yeah, I think this kind of reiterates Aidan's point. Like, we've done really well for sure. Also, it was the easy part. Like, we have to say that was the easy part. Like, fuel switching was the easy part. The hard part is the rest of this. And we do have all these targets, but we're not on track in pretty much any of them.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think this comes through sort of maybe a deeper malaise a bit in the UK, in that we are very good at planning, very good at setting targets, very good at having comprehensive ways to do the plans, and then not so good at actually delivering. So we have a lot of work, and it's very good work on how to reach these targets, very comprehensive, but the actual delivery is where maybe we fall short. And I think this is a problem across the energy sector, maybe across the UK as a whole, that we do fall short in delivery, a lack of joined up strategy and coordination in both governments, both nationally and locally, and coordination with companies, often changing political priorities. It's sometimes quite difficult. And we are now moving out of the sort of planning and initiation phase of net zero into the full-scale delivery phase. So this decade is crucial. We need to build, I think the current government target is 50 gigawatts of offshore wind. We've got about a quarter of that so far, so we're going to need to massively expand that. We will need to massively expand our grid and grid connections. As Nadine has pointed out, we will need to massively expand our nuclear. And if we don't do these, then we will fall short of our targets. And this is where we can't dilly-dally around, basically. We can't say we're going to carry on at the same rate we're going. We need to maybe going at 2 or 3 times the rate we currently are.
And why do we fall short on delivery then, without pointing too many fingers? What's the biggest barriers that stops us from moving at the speed that we should be?
So we actually published a briefing paper earlier this year on the transition towards to a net zero electricity grid by 2035. So this is quite a comprehensive look at every single sector of the grid, and also the grid enablers. Because transforming the electricity grid to net zero by 2035 is an absolute gigantic project. In terms of actual scale, it's, as we said in the paper, roughly equivalent to delivering 11 HS2 railways on time and on budget by 2035 in terms of money and resources. So it's absolutely massive. So we did identify some areas where we don't match up, and top on this was actually strategy, coordination and governance. So the UK government as a whole has a 2035 target. The UK government, and now it's a 2030 target actually for this, so it's only 6 years, less than 6 years now. But the actual sort of joined up thinking to actually push this through from national government down to local government to consultation with companies to basically ensuring planning permissions there, to ensure that the skills are there, to push it to ensure that the financing's there. There's a sort of let's leave it up. We're going to tell National Grid they need to do this, but let's leave it up to them. And they can't develop this on their own. They need help from other places. And I think that sort of lack of joined up coordination of governments right from the top actually has been a real issue.
Policy and governance keeps coming up over again. The text there, the will's there, the strategy's there, but the actual delivery and doing it is lacking. Is there anyone that are getting this right in terms of other countries, or is everyone in the same boat?
It's an interesting question. I think the UK is quite far ahead in terms of just deployment of generation. We're quite far ahead in deployment of offshore winds, and it's difficult to point to another country which is absolutely perfectly getting it right. There's countries which maybe have a slightly easier ride. For example, France has already got a lot of nuclear power, so in order to decarbonise its generation, it doesn't need to do as much work as we do. But in terms of the actual sort of facts on the ground, the actual interaction with the public, getting people on board, I think countries across Europe are struggling on this. We saw France with the Yellow Vest movement. We saw Germany and basically a bit of a backlash against heat pumps there, insulation. And of course we see in America that it's quite a political issue. The Republicans really don't like clean energy at all. And even though Joe Biden has pushed very hard for clean energy in the Inflation Reduction Act, it is still very much on the supply side and not the demand side, the actual changing people's lives side. You need a heat pump, you need an electric vehicle, you need to put up with renewable energy near you, that kind of thing. There's sort of sacrifices that a lot of people will need to make if we go down this route, isn't really there. So no, I don't think there is necessarily a country that could point at this country knows what's going on.
It's a bit of everything.
Yeah, and electricity generation is very localised. It's very localised problems in each country. Sunnier countries have more solar, maybe less wind. Countries with less coastline have to have more onshore wind. The UK has a lot of natural advantages, basically. But yeah, I don't think we can necessarily point at anything. But I think in our particular point of view, I think a lack of coordination and governance is a real problem. And actually, it's very interesting that one of the first things the nuclear Labour government has done is set up these sort of missions, one of them being this climate change sustainability net zero mission, in order to attempt at least to streamline some of these decisions, so different government departments are at least facing the same way and doing the same stuff rather than working independently.
Yeah, amazing. Nadine, I wonder if you wanted to pick up that as well, the sort of strategy, coordination and governance challenges, obstacles. What's on your radar in terms of what's happening and what could we be doing a bit better?
I think it really depends on the technology. So some technologies, for example, the major challenge would be public acceptance, whereas some technologies, the major challenge could be the permitting issues, and some, it just really depends on technology that you want to kind of deploy. I think, as Aidan said, one of the things actually that's really good about the UK in terms of just governance is that actually there's quite good public acceptance in terms of wanting to do this clean energy and reaching net zero targets, and so sometimes you would think that you're going to have a backlash because of public acceptance, but then I think after speaking to quite a lot of people in the field, it seems like actually the public acceptance is quite high of the majority of technologies. Everyone is in on getting to net zero, but yes, in terms of it just really depends on the technology, and I'm not really sure why we fall short when it comes to deployment. But I think Aidan pointed out really good things, and they've done the research.
we mentioned a bit about buy-in and trust and kind of getting people on side with some of this, and I agree. I think everyone I speak to are in the camp of this is the direction we need to go in, but I know from the nuclear side that there has been some pushback, and I suppose it's trying to get community cohesion in getting people in on this journey. Where are the sort of the pushbacks from the general public at this stage?
So yeah, as I said, it really depends on the technology. So with nuclear power, a lot of the pushback comes from safety and nuclear waste handling. I think one of the things, for example, when it comes to waste handling, we've been handling waste for a very, very long time. And we've been handling worse waste for a very, very, very long time than the nuclear waste. And in terms of safety, I mean, there's a lot of statistics on this, but it's really, really safe in terms to do nuclear power quite next to you, especially that we have a lot of boards, we have a lot of policies, we have a lot of governance when it comes to nuclear power. So it's quite safe. But I would say this is one of the major things. So when we had the launch for this, there were people asking these questions about safety, and it was answered quite well with like all the statistics that I can't really tell you right now. But those statistics exist to show that it's safe, and I think it's just that the right information might not always be disseminated to the public, and that is true for like a lot of different technologies. And I think, for example, based on a lot of conversations I've had with the general public, I think a lot of the general public assumes that, we could reach net zero just by doing renewables. And they're like, why are we even looking at anything else? We should be doing just renewables. And, we can't. Like, we can't reach net zero with just renewables. It's just not possible. It's not scientifically possible. It's not engineering. Like, it's just not possible to do just renewables. And you will need a mix inevitably. And so that's why I always say there's no silver bullet technology. We can't just do renewables for everything. For example, even if we assumed, we could do all of electricity from renewable energy, there are still process emissions. And that's even if that's not possible. I just want to clarify that. But like, we still have process emissions, we have transport emissions, and so on and so forth. And so it's not as simple as, let's just deploy renewable energy. And so I think that the facts or like the information is not reaching the general public well, or with the statistics and the science and everything. And then some assumptions are made, and then that's kind of, propagated forward. So I think that's the major thing.
That's why they call them wicked problems, because we've gone from drilling to mining, and if we are to put thousands and thousands of turbines everywhere, that comes with its own problem. If we're going to put solar panels, it comes with its own problem. So, and I think it's trying to find a mixture of solutions so that depending on what happens in terms of materials, in terms of the weather, in terms of what happens globally, we need to be making sure that we've got a range of different inputs from energy and different things that fit within the right infrastructure. I don't know, Aidan, if you wanted to touch on that in terms of public buy-in and people's opinions of what's going on at the moment.
So I think public buy-in is actually, as Nadine said, pretty good in the UK compared to other countries. Part of this, I think, is because the public haven't been asked to do that much. They've been asked to accept wind turbines near them maybe occasionally, or solar farms. But in terms of actually getting to net zero, we're going to need to replace everyone's gas boilers eventually with heat pumps, for example. We're going to have to replace most of the cars on the road with electric vehicles by 2050. And this is where you might run into issues, especially I think when it comes to domestic heating. You're basically saying we're going to replace your gas boiler, which you know how to use, with this other technology which tends to be bigger, bulkier, probably noisier as well because you've got a big fan outside, and it doesn't heat up your house as fast, so you need to use it in a different way, slightly more continuously, maybe heating up your house during the night time, for example, instead of just turning on heat when you want it and having a warm house half an hour later. So I think we've seen this already in other countries, as I said earlier, Germany, for example, that there's been some pushback from heat pumps because this is technology which isn't sort of centralized and outside people's daily lives like electricity tends to be. It's technology which is actually in your house and requires disruption and movement and a fair amount of money as well to change. And people don't really think about heat that much. So people have a gas boiler. When that gas boiler breaks, they buy a new gas boiler. It's called a distress purchase. You don't usually go out and buy a gas boiler because it's better than your previous gas boiler. People don't think about it that way. So the idea of changing to a heat pump is something which is going to be, I think, we're going to run into trouble there, especially if you look at the low uptake rates. Electric vehicles as well, maybe. I think they've been a lot more successful in public acceptance. They're seen as a bit of status symbols. They're fun to drive. They are, in some ways, better technology than the petrol cars that they are replacing. They accelerate faster. They're just more fun to use, basically. But you are going to get pushback from people who like petrol vehicles, who like the front of the engine, who like the sort of gearhead sort of tweaking and stuff which you just can't do with an electric car, and you'll get that pushback, and the sort of I guess innate conservatism there will will run in. I think we'll see some challenges there as well, because it wouldn't be seen as a choice come 2030 or 2035 when we stop the sale of new petrol cars. It would be seen as an obligation, and I think that's a very different psychological point of view for public.
Massively. My dad is a petrol head. He loves cars, loves bikes, and there's a slight sadness in his eye when I talk about electrification, and he understands it's the way to go. But there's a lot of people that love and the heritage of cars they love, and this actually might lead quite nicely into consumption. So we've talked about generation, distribution, a little bit about grids. We could talk about grids a lot more, but I think this would be quite a nice time to talk about people and the fact that we've all got a part in this story and the narrative, and people are, and when it comes to personal choices, a car is one of the most expensive things that someone will buy. A house, and the way that we operate a house, it's very personal to people, and we have to be quite sensitive how we talk to people and how we get people to change the way that they heat their homes. What are your experience in terms of going forward, Nadine, about how we're going to get people to buy into this electrification and to change the way that they live their lives?
I think it goes back to my previous point, like just being honest and transparent, like genuinely giving the right information and being honest and transparent about it. So, for example, I did a bit of work with fast fashion, and it's one of the main things is that like we can't, at least in my opinion, to be honest, I don't know if we should be making this the consumer problem. Just because, like if we're gonna say that, this is fully your problem, you're the reason we're not reaching net zero, I just don't know if we're achieving much. But if we work together and like make sure that the right information is out there, giving the consumer the choice about what's going on in terms of like, what's more sustainable, what's not more sustainable. And I think acknowledging that, as Aidan said, a lot of it is psychological. So, for example, people are willing, for example, for fashion, people are willing to pay a lot more for a certain dress or a certain bag and so on, because of either status or anything like that, or like quality, for instance. And so I think the way we market a lot of things is just by the fact that it's more sustainable, and that might not appeal to everyone. So maybe we should be changing that in some instances, at least maybe for fashion. So yes, I can market a sustainable dress, but maybe market it in a different way. So I think thinking about these things as more than just targets, and thinking about, how are we going to transform them into business models. And that is actually also true when it comes to industry, because you need when you do the policies, we're really good at that, targets, blah, blah, blah. We need industry to get in on this, but to get them in on this, we need some form of business models that would make it work and make it competitive, and you wouldn't have a monopoly in any of the technologies. And then when it comes to consumption, again, like you need some form of business model, which is way, way out of my expertise. But I think I'm just using the fashion example because it's something that I worked on, and that was very with the public. But as far as I saw, like people were very, very interested. But you're going to have to do more, I think, than just say, this is sustainable. With heat pumps, there's like grants and subsidies and stuff like that. And so it's going to have to be more than just it being sustainable, because I think, we have a lot to think about during our day.
And people don't often know what sustainable means. And I like the fact that you talked about awareness, education, guidance, and a lot of people talk about choice architecture, by giving people the choices so that they're aware of the different choices, and then educating them why it's a better choice. I don't think we've got this right at all. And I think in terms of working towards zero carbon and sustainability, and getting people to make better choices in their life about more sustainable choices, whatever sustainability means to them, is an educational thing. And that's why I enjoy working in communications, because it's a communications challenge now to get people to understand why we're making these decisions, why things are moving in these directions. Aidan, I don't know if you wanted to jump on that and look at sort of communication and education in this area.
Well, I was actually, one of the things I was going to maybe say is that I think a focus on individual choices is maybe not the best way necessarily to go forward. While people obviously want to know how to minimise their carbon footprints on the individual level, really this is a kind of drop in the ocean compared to where we need to go. We need to think about this stuff at a society level and very much a corporate level as well. Big companies, big industry need to be directly responsible for their own carbon emissions rather than expecting their consumers to take more sustainable options. For example, if we just look in the last couple of years, the rise of AI technology has increased world energy consumption by about 1 to 2%, I believe. And that's just basically the big tech companies jumping on these very energy-intensive AI technologies and then delivering them to the consumer. So it's really up to those companies to make that consumption sustainable. There's very little the consumer that can do there. I mean, previously we had the rise of cryptocurrency, and the Bitcoin network was at one point using more electricity than the entire country of Argentina. Most of that was going on basically completely useless, worthless cryptographic transactions, which were just there because the cryptocurrency algorithm itself was badly designed for scalability, so it was incredibly energy inefficient. So there needs to be, I think, not just a focus on whether you walk or take or drive to your school, or whether you get sustainable fashion or non-sustainable fashion, but actually a sort of idea that corporations, that governments are themselves also incredibly responsible for these, and their carbon footprint needs to be dropped dramatically.
Can I just add something? So, so like even when it comes to carbon accounting, organizations, so there's different scopes they have to kind of consider. Scope 1 is their direct emissions within their building, for instance. Scope 2 is their electricity and heating. Very easy. You get a bill. You probably know the energy mix of the country you're operating in. And then Scope 3 has like a lot of different categories, both upstream and downstream. And one of them is end-of-life use of the products. And so a lot of companies, talk about how are we supposed to be measuring this and so on. And sometimes some of those companies, for example, are producing something that's just not recyclable, for instance. And so, if you're producing something that's not recyclable, has zero circularity in the design, is not like produced for longevity. Like if you're doing that, then obviously just maximize that. You're not doing it well. So yes, absolutely. Like I think this goes back to my point of saying like I find it hard to say this is a consumer problem because it's up to organizations to do better.
Yeah, I agree. So we've talked about generation, we've talked about distribution, we've now talked a bit about the consumer, and we kind of keep sort of anchoring back to industry and policy about these things. And there probably is a lot of listeners that are listening to this thinking, well, I want to do my bit. They may be activists, environmentalists, like doing work in conservation, but they want to do more. And we know that policy and industry is where the big changes will happen. Let's talk about jobs, because it's something that I know, Aidan, that you've been doing a lot of work in recently. Where are the opportunities for young people or for students or for anyone that's looking to develop their profession and career and their pathway? Where are the opportunities at the moment?
Yeah, well, we are going through a large transition here. So we are transitioning away from oil and gas, fossil fuels, to renewable energy, to electrification. And I think electrification mostly is where things are going on. So while we had about 75-80% of our total energy consumption being through primary fossil fuel, through gas burnt in your house, through gas burnt in your office, through petrol burnt in your car, we're moving to electrifying these sectors. So eventually the idea would be that wouldn't happen that much, and it would all go through electrification. So we need to massively expand the grid. So if you're interested in power systems engineering, power engineering, there's a huge amount of work there. If you're interested in basically implementation, construction work for all this stuff, engineering on the ground, that's all important. If you're interested in installation, so we need a lot more heat pump engineers, for example, to go out and install these heat pumps we talked about. We need to also transfer a lot of the offshore oil and gas jobs we had, and I think this is happening already, to offshore wind installation jobs, because an awful lot of the skills are directly transferable.
I've got my brother-in-law and one of my best friends are electricians, and I'm always sending them like courses in like doing solar PV and heat pumps. I think they're probably getting a bit annoyed with me, but I think if anyone's an electrician or an engineer and they're curious about this and they're interested, there's also a lot of support now for engineers and for electricians and anyone in this space to kind of work in these areas. And we know that the green economy is booming already. I think eventually it won't be called the green economy, it will just be called the economy. And so I think if people are wanting to move into this space, this is a great time. But in terms of the other areas, looking at policy, the government, in terms of driving industry in the right direction, well, what other areas could people listening to this move into in terms of careers?
So industries are going to need to think very carefully about what they do, and I think we've done it, challenges, talked about this a bit already. I mean, there are some, like for example, tech industries need to work out where their electricity is coming from if their stuff's getting more intensive, for example. Industry, actually heavy industry in the UK, will need to decarbonise, and this is one of the more challenging areas, I think. How do you decarbonise cement production? How do you decarbonise steel production? How do you decarbonise a lot of the process industry we've got in a way which is sustainable and successful? So we need to think about carbon capture and storage for these industries, like low carbon industry hubs, hydrogen hubs, those kind of things. And there's going to be a lot of work in developing this.
Yeah, cool. And Nadine, other areas, jobs, work, any opportunities that you've seen in your work?
I mean, we've talked a bit about the nuclear power jobs, so I think that would be, that's crucial. And just to make sure we don't lose those transferable skills. And I think, as Aidan mentioned, there's quite a lot that we can transfer the skills to. So, for example, the offshore oil and gas to offshore wind, but also like all the infrastructure that we had built for oil and gas of pipelines and so on and so forth. We're going to need pipelines for CO2 that we capture. We're going to need pipelines for hydrogen that we're going to be using. And then another one that's, for example, directly transferable is CO2 storage. So once we capture the CO2, we need to store it somewhere. And again, that's directly transferable from the oil and gas industry. And so there's a lot of skills that's transferable, which is really good. And I think we just need to make sure that we do transfer those skills and we don't lose them in between. And then when it comes to like the energy transition and just getting to net zero, if you get into any job that's related to that, I think you're good for the next 50 years.
Yeah, I think you're sorted. I'm going to keep pushing like engineers and scientists roles for my children. I'll keep they want to be singers and actors at the moment. I'm like, I'll watch this space. You're going to be an engineer or scientist.
Yeah, I think there's also another point here. We talked about this right at the beginning, that the UK is relatively far ahead on this curve. So there's not just jobs necessarily in the UK, but people trained in the UK could be also consulting in other countries, working in other countries, because there are countries which will require expertise if we develop it well. So there is an opportunity for global leadership in at least some areas here.
And very privileged to be working here at Imperial, which is a big emphasis on industrial placements, learning key skills, very good connections with industry, and the qualifications here are really set up well to be able to move globally into these different areas. And also coming from a communications creative point of view, any career now could be working towards or be in an industry or within the green economy. So from communicators to lawyers to designers and engineers and software development. We've mentioned there about cryptocurrencies, and we've talked about AI. So if we could get more software engineers, more people that are building, more entrepreneurs that are building these companies to be thinking sustainably about what servers they're using, how much energy is being consumed through their applications. Have you seen any opportunities in terms of, or any areas where we're seeing people moving into other sectors and other verticals or categories where they're using sustainability to drive that business forward?
Yeah, for sure. I was actually going to comment on that. I I work with a lot of people that do very different things than science and engineering and are still contributing to the energy transition. So, for example, I'm working right now on a paper that involves a lawyer, and it's a response to a consultation. But essentially, she looks into, for example, all the litigation processes when it comes to greenwashing, for instance, and whether you're doing your carbon accounting properly or not, and so on and so forth. My sister is a machine learning scientist, so we're, for example, working on things and seeing how we can look at CO2 emissions and profile them and demand and so on and so forth. But also, we're going to start looking into like the CO2 emissions of AI and how we were going to anticipate that, which is quite interesting to kind of use AI to kind of look into it. So that's like from a software perspective, but also, for example, my sister takes a lot of courses in terms of, she has to take a lot of courses in terms of how to make her stuff more sustainable. So like her coding more sustainable and use less lines or just use less power, and how to make it just more efficient, essentially, which was, well, it's more sustainable, but also it just means her code's more efficient so she can get more done faster and so on. And so I've worked with economists when it comes to carbon markets. Not worked, I still do work with economists, science communications. And so there's I mean, in the past couple of years, I've actually worked with a lot of different professions that are working towards sustainability. And so, for example, I also consulted on a project that has to do with medtech. They were looking at devices that would basically kind of get you the diagnosis faster, or earlier, which would mean a less load on the NHS. So there's a less load on the NHS would lead to less emissions, basically. And so there's a lot of things that are working towards this, and you could pretty much be in any space and still contribute to sustainability, because you could basically do whatever you're doing just more efficiently and taking into account. And the last example, is my friend. She's an architect. And she actually models how to build buildings more sustainably. So where should we be putting our electric sockets, and what materials should we be using, and so on and so forth. And so again, I talked to her a lot about this. So it's really interesting, because I think when I first started doing my PhD, a lot of people didn't really know what I was doing, and they were like, why do we care? What is happening? And then now, when I finished my PhD and as I do my research, now my parents, every time there's an article about climate change, they're like, look, this is something you're working on. I'm like, yeah, I told you this 7 years ago.
I love the coupling of, here at university, the coupling between employability and sustainability, that you can be more employable if you're more educated and more passionate about sustainability, but also in terms of career pathways, you can progress further, you can diversify your career in other areas by using sustainability, by being more sustainably minded, by implementing more design thinking within sustainability. And I think that's really exciting. That's really nice. And anything you wanted to add there in terms of opportunities or where careers or jobs are going?
I think Nadine is absolutely correct. Sustainability needs to be woven through every sort of part of our society, and I think that's what we talked about a bit earlier with corporate responsibility need to be just as important, if not more so, than personal responsibility. And I think intelligent corporations, I think well-run corporations are well in on sustainability, because sustainability means less energy use. It means smarter business. It means less cost, and especially now with our high energy prices, from historically high energy prices, energy use is important to get down as much as possible. So yeah, smart companies will be sustainable. They will be the companies that you want to work for, because they'll be the ones who will do better, basically.
Brilliant. Well, I'm going to start bringing this podcast to a close in a bit, but we've touched on something. I'm going to bring it to an end with, I wouldn't normally do this, but I'd actually quite like to talk about finance very quickly, because we've talked about money and we've talked about industry, and financing the transition is going to be a huge thing, whether it be finance personally, but financing from the government. I know maybe finance is not our specialism, but the money, we've got to pay for these things. And I suppose maybe that might be slowing some things down in terms of how the money's moving around. And Aidan, I'll kind of put this onto you. Where does the money need to be moving now? Where should we be investing finances from a government perspective?
So, I mean, from a government perspective, what the government's mostly interested in doing at the moment with its launch of Great British Energy and its mission-created thing is attempt to sort of steer private finance towards these large sustainable projects. So the idea that the government wouldn't finance it all itself, but provide some seed funding to basically, I guess, secure the projects, make them more safer for large-scale investment to do. So this is sort of, I guess, leveraging. But what we need to do really is we have a huge amount of money globally which goes into fossil fuel extraction, refining and use, and we need to transfer a lot of that investment flow to renewable new technologies. So it's not that sustainability will cost more over the long run, that the net zero will cost more over the long run. There is, however, high capital costs to get us going, and then there will be lower variable costs once we're there, because when the wind blows and the sun shines, you're not burning fuel like you were before. So a lot of this is getting that capital funding done so we can build the infrastructure so we can get going. And this is where this sort of streamlining process needs to go, basically. So this is where you do need industrial strategy. You need government and industry working together, and government knowing that industry feeling secure that government isn't going to change its targets like we saw with the last Conservative government just overnight. There's a long-term plan, and they will be supportive through that, and government knowing that industry is interested and willing to invest. And I think that is probably the major difference between this government and the last government, the idea that there should be this industrial coordination, which I think has been missing in the UK for a bit.
Amazing. And Nadine, if you had the keys to the safe, where should we be manoeuvring the finance now across the country?
I think I completely agree with Aidan, like in terms of just long-term business models. And when I say long-term, it's because it decreases the risk for private financing. So they need to know that there's a clear long-term signal from policy, and so it would just mean that there's less risk on whatever they're financing, whatever project they are financing. And based on like talking to a lot of people in the industry, that is the one thing everyone kind of looks into, like what is the long-term policy? Will that change if anything changes, if governments changes, or is it a long-term thing? And I think once we do that, at some point it'll just there will be a business model, there will be a market for it, just kind of like how we have oil and gas markets and everything. And then the government can back off and can just be like, okay, we're done here. So we've helped in the beginning, and then the rest will just work itself out.
Great. Good. Well, I think we've just solved the UK Energy Challenge there in about 40 minutes. So thank you very much. Nadine, if people want to find out more about you and your research and what you do, where can we send them? Where's the best place to contact you?
I will say LinkedIn. But also the Imperial profiles are up, so our emails should be there for anyone to contact.
And we can put that all in the show notes. Same with you, Aidan?
Yeah, I mean, both my LinkedIn page and also just the Energy Futures Lab website as a whole, you can find our briefing papers and white papers that we publish there.
Great, yep, we'll put that all in the show notes. But yep, thank you for your time. That's been amazing. And I look forward to chatting to you about all those different topics in due course. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to the Energy Futures podcast. Here at Energy Futures Lab, we are dedicated to addressing global energy challenges through pioneering research, innovation, and advocacy. To learn more about us and the exciting projects we are working on, visit our website and follow us on social media. If you enjoyed this episode, please like and share and subscribe to stay up to date with our latest content. Until next time, stay curious.